Have you ever had the experience of someone reading your writing and they didn't love it? Maybe it was at a workshop, maybe it was a critique partner, maybe it was someone you trusted and whose opinion really mattered to you, and their words landed somewhere so tender you're still carrying them around weeks later, perhaps months, wondering if they were right. Feedback is supposed to make us better writers, but for a lot of writers it does something else entirely. It stops them. It sends them into a spiral of second guessing so deep they can't find their way back to the page. In today's episode, I want to change that. I'm going to show you how to receive feedback like a professional, and it's not by growing a thicker skin or by caring less, but it's by understanding exactly what's happening when criticism lands and giving you a 4-step method to process it without losing yourself or your writing in the process. If you've ever let somebody else's words derail your writing, this episode is for you. If you feel called to write a book, but writer's block, procrastination, and self-doubt keep pulling you from the page, you're not alone, and you're not meant to stay stuck. Hi, I'm Madison Michaels, author and life coach, and I've created this podcast as a creative space grounded in faith and mindset transformations to help you break through your blocks, gain creative clarity, and finally finish the book you're meant to write. So grab your cup of liquid gold and let's write the darn book together. Hello, my friends, and welcome back to Write the Darn Book. I'm your host, Madison Michaels, and today we're talking about something every writer encounters at some point, and that is negative feedback. And I'm going to give you some tools on how to receive it, how to process it, and how to keep writing anyway without letting it shake your identity or silence your voice. Here's something I want you to understand about feedback and about why it hits so hard when it's critical or harsh or simply not what we'd hoped to receive. When you write something and you share it, you're not just handing over words on a page, you're handing over a piece of your interior world. Every story you write is drawn from your emotional experience, from your observations, your imagination, your deepest sense of truth. And that's not a small thing to give someone. That's an act of extraordinary vulnerability, even when it doesn't feel like it. So when someone responds to that work with criticism, even well-intentioned constructive criticism, it doesn't register in the brain as information about the writing. It registers as information about you and who you are as a writer. At a neurological level, creative rejection activates the same neural pathways as social rejection. Your brain interprets it as a threat to your sense of self, your place in the group, and your worth. That's not a weakness. That is biology in action. Now, the problem is when we don't understand what's happening, we respond from that threatened place. We either collapse, and that's through shutting down or putting the manuscript away completely, telling ourselves that we were never good enough to write it anyway, or we armor up and we over-edit the life out of our work, trying to please everyone, changing our voice in the process to match someone else's expectations, and writing defensively instead of freely. Neither response serves your writing, and neither response serves you either. So today, I want to offer you something different. I'm going to teach you a way to receive feedback that honours your craft, honours the courage it took you to share your work, and it honours your own judgment as the author without dismissing useful input and without being destroyed by it. Now, I want to tell you about something that happened before I'd even finished my first full book. I was in that between stage that a lot of writers find themselves in. I was deeply invested in a manuscript. I was writing the chapters, I was developing the story, but I was nowhere near finished the draft. But I decided to enter some of that work into some writing competitions so I could get some feedback and see how I was going. So I entered a chapter excerpt, I think it was 1, maybe 2 chapters, into a writing competition. And this is where your work goes before a panel of judges and it comes back with some critique sheets and scores. So I got 3 critiques back, and 2 of them were extraordinary. Like, they were super, super high scores. I think it was only like 4 off 100. And there was genuine praise for my writing. And some specific comments in there too that told me that the judges had really understood exactly what I was reaching for and responded to it. By any objective measure, that feedback was overwhelmingly positive. And if you'd shown those 3 sheets to someone who didn't know me and asked them to summarize the verdict, they would have said, yeah, your writing's really good. But that wasn't what I focused on. Of course, I focused on the one negative critique, the low score, the harsh comments from that one judge. Now, I read that 3rd critique over and over and over again, and everything the other 2 judges had said just dissolved. It's like it hadn't even happened or been said. I literally sat with the one critique that was the negative feedback, and I let it build a case against me. I kept thinking, gosh, maybe I can't write. Maybe I'm not a real writer. Maybe the 2 positive judges were just being kind and the 3rd one was the only one telling me the truth. I felt genuinely so low and so discouraged. I was depressed about my writing in a way that affected how I showed up to the page for weeks. Honestly, a part of me felt like perhaps I shouldn't keep writing at all. And imagine if I'd listened to that part of me and I didn't keep writing. So here's what I understand now that I didn't have the framework to understand back then. What was happening in my brain wasn't a rational assessment of the evidence. Because if we're being logical, 2 highly positive critiques against 1 negative one isn't a crisis. That's a result that most writers would be thrilled with. The logic of the situation said, the writing is connecting, the writing is working, I'm doing really well. But I wasn't processing the feedback logically. I was processing it through a filter that was already primed to look for proof of failure. My brain went hunting for the evidence that confirmed what my inner critic had always worried about and suspected. And the moment I found 1 negative critique, that part of me that had self-doubt and was critical of myself grabbed a hold of that negative critique and it held onto it and dismissed the other 2 positive critiques as just noise. Now, that 3rd critique, in retrospect, actually told me far more about that particular judge, their taste, their expectations, their personal preferences for what a story should be, than it actually told me about my writing. I made it about me, which is what we all do when we actually get a critique. So because I felt it was about me, that it confirmed all my self-doubts, I folded it into my identity and wore it around me for weeks like it was a verdict about my writing. But it wasn't. But I didn't have a way to sort that out at the time and to recognize that. That's what I want to give you today. Earlier, I talked about why feedback lands the way it does, how creative rejection activates the same neural pathways as social rejection, and how your brain interprets criticism of your writing as a threat to your sense of self. That's the why. Understanding it is very important, but it's only half the work. The other half is knowing what to do with it. Today, I want to walk you through what I call the 4-step feedback processing method. These steps are designed to move you from the reactive identity level response that collapses either the armor that you put into place into a grounded, clear-eyed relationship with the feedback in front of you. Now, the first step is don't process feedback when you first receive it. And this sounds simple, and it's wildly underused. You see, when feedback arrives, especially feedback that stings, your nervous system is activated. You're not in a state to evaluate information clearly. You're in protection mode. And when you're in protection mode, your brain distorts things. It amplifies the criticism and it filters out the rest. So the first step is to receive the feedback, acknowledge it with gratitude if it's appropriate to do so, and then put it somewhere you don't have to look at it for at least 24 hours. That's not avoidance. This is strategy. You need your nervous system to settle before your analytical brain can do its job. So give it time to settle. Step 2 is to separate the emotional response from the information. When you come back to the feedback, your first task is to separate what you feel about it from what it actually says. And these are two different things, and conflating them is the source of almost all feedback spirals. Read through the feedback, and for each point, ask, what is actually being said here? Strip away the tone, the framing, the delivery. What is the underlying observation? You might find that a comment that felt devastating is at its core pointing to something specific and addressable. You might also find that some feedback is purely subjective, a preference, a taste, a genre expectation that doesn't necessarily apply to your book. Both things can be true simultaneously. Write down what the feedback is actually saying in your own neutral language. This act of translation pulls you out of the emotional charge and into clear thinking. Step 3 is to run the feedback through the 2 filter test. And the 2 filters are craft and intention. The craft filter asks, is this feedback pointing to something that would make my writing technically stronger? Could be clarity, pacing, character consistency, point of view, tension. These are all craft elements. And if the feedback identifies a genuine craft issue, that's useful information regardless of how it was delivered or who delivered it. The intention filter asks, is this feedback aligned with the book I'm trying to write? And this is where your judgment as an author comes in. You have an intention for this story. You know what you're reaching for, what effect you're after, and what emotional truth you're trying to have land. Some feedback will be aligned with that intention and will help you get closer to it. Other feedback will be pulling in a different direction toward the book the reader would have written, not the book you're writing. And you're allowed to note that feedback, acknowledge the reader's experience, and choose not to incorporate it. A single piece of feedback that fails both filters, that doesn't improve your craft and it doesn't serve your intention for your book, doesn't need to change a single word of your manuscript. Now, step 4 is to make a clear decision and return to the work. This is the step, though, that most writers skip, and it's the most important one. Once you've processed the feedback, you need to make a decision about each point. Accept it and revise, or note it and release it. Both are valid, but you must decide clearly and consciously rather than leaving the feedback floating in an unresolved cloud over your manuscript. Unresolved feedback is one of the most insidious forms of writing paralysis there is. When you haven't decided what to do with it, it just sits there in the back of your mind, generating doubt. And every time you open up your story, the criticism resurfaces and you write from a place of uncertainty and fear instead of trust and intention. So make the decision. And even if you decide to sit with it for another week, that's a decision. Even if you decide to get a second opinion before acting, that's a decision. Moving from ambiguity into clarity is what allows you to return to your writing with confidence. Now, I want to say one more thing about feedback sources, because not all feedback is equal, and it matters enormously who you are receiving it from. Feedback from a developmental editor with experience in your genre, or from a writing mentor who knows your voice and your goals, carries different weight than feedback from a well-meaning friend who doesn't read in your genre. Feedback from readers who are your target audience is also more relevant to your story's landing than feedback from someone who primarily reads nonfiction, for example. Workshop feedback, unless the participants are deeply familiar with your genre and your intention, often reflects the workshop culture as much as the actual work. This doesn't mean that only take feedback from experts. It means factor in the source of the feedback as part of your evaluation of it. The 4-step method applies regardless, but knowing who gave you the feedback helps you calibrate how much weight to give the craft filter and how much weight to give the intention filter. And here's the thing I need you to hear. Receiving feedback well is a skill. It's not a personality trait, and it's not something some writers have and others don't. It's something you practice, and it gets easier every time you do it. Now, I do want to acknowledge something. Depending on how you're wired, feedback can land harder for some personality types than for others. If you're a dove writer, criticism can feel like a rupture in connection and something deeply personal and relational. If you're an owl, a low score or a critical assessment can feel like an attack on your competence and your standards. Peacocks, who are energized by enthusiasm and response, can find a flat or negative reaction genuinely deflating in a way that affects their creative momentum. And eagles, who hold themselves to a high bar, can find criticism of their work particularly confronting because their standards are part of their writing identity. So yes, the impact of feedback is very real, and it is shaped by your wiring. What changes with practice, though, isn't your personality, it's your capacity to hold the feedback at arm's length long enough to evaluate it clearly before it gets inside your sense of who you are as a writer. And the writers who seem unbothered by criticism aren't caring less. They've just built a framework for holding it, and you can build that too. If today's episode has landed for you, if you've recognized yourself in that pattern of zeroing in on the one critical voice while the positive ones fade into the background, that recognition is worth acting on, because that pattern doesn't just live in how you receive feedback. It lives in how you show up to the page every day and in the stories you tell yourself about whether your writing is good enough, whether you're a real writer, or whether your book is worth finishing. And that's exactly the kind of work I do with writers in my writing coaching. Not just the practical strategies, but the identity level patterns underneath them. And sometimes the shift from stuck to flowing happens in a single conversation. I offer a free 15-minute clarity call for writers who want to explore whether coaching is the right next step for them. It's no pressure and no pitch, just a genuine conversation to see whether I might be able to help you. So head to madisonmichaels.com/call and book in your free 15-minute clarity call. You can also find the link in the show notes, because I genuinely love to chat to see whether I can actually help you and whether we might be a fit to work together. All right, my friends, feedback is not the final word on your writing. Please remember that. I mean, just think about how many times J.K. Rowling's Harry Potter book was rejected by publishers. If she had given up after 10 negative experiences of bad feedback, we wouldn't have Harry Potter in the world, which is one of my favourites. So look, keep writing. Remember, feedback is just one reader's experience, and it's filtered through their own tastes, their own knowledge, and their own assumptions about what a story should be. Your job isn't to satisfy every reader before the book's even finished. Your job is to write the truest, most powerful version of this story of yours that you can. And then you send it out into the world and let it find its people. You're allowed to receive input without being ruled by it. And you're allowed to take what serves the work and to release what doesn't. And most of all, you are allowed to keep writing, even when someone's response to your writing wasn't what you'd hoped for. Remember, my friends, you are the vessel for your story, and you're the only one that can write it. So let the words flow through you and onto the page. Take care, and I'll see you in the next episode, and let's write the darn book together. My friend, I hope today's episode gave you exactly what you needed for your writing journey. And if it did, would you take 30 seconds to share it with another writer who's struggling to start or finish their book? And if you're loving the show, I'd be so grateful if you left a quick review. It means the world to me and truly makes my day to know that this podcast is helping you. And as you head back into your week, I hope you feel more supported and connected to your creativity. And remember, you're a vessel for the story. So let the words flow through you and onto the page. All right, I'm off to refill my cup of liquid gold and go and do a little writing of my own. Take care, and I'll meet you back here in the next episode of Write the Darn Book.